Welcome everyone to Almost Cancelled. I am Peter, and today I'm going to be talking about Tokyo Vice Season 1, Episode 1. It is called The Test. It is a first episode, so I'll start spoiler free. This is a new HBO Max show. It ranked high on the Patreon pilot vote, which is why I'm talking about it today. Michael Mann directed the first episode, which is pretty notable, which I didn't know or remember going into it, but when I got to the end of the episode and it came up saying directed by Michael Mann, I was like, oh, that actually clicks. That makes sense. I definitely recognize some of his style without realizing it was him until I saw his name. Especially early on, there's some tense sequences at the start. It does a thing where the episode starts much later in the timeline. It starts 10 years into the story in 2009, when our main character, played by Ansel Elgort, Jake Adelstein, that's his name. He is a reporter working in Japan, and he is working with a police officer played by Ken Watanabe, and they're going on some kind of meeting with the Yakuza, and it's very tense. There's a lot of handheld camera, which kind of stuck out, which is the thing that stuck out to me the most as the directions. So when I saw Michael Mann's name at the end, I was like, oh, okay, all of a sudden that part makes sense. But it only gets a little bit into the meeting, and then it cuts back 10 years. It cuts back to 1999, which is where the rest of the episode actually takes place. It's not one of those TV things where it catches up to this point by the end of the episode. It doesn't cut back and forth, at least not yet in episode 1. But it goes back to when he is studying. Our main character is studying for the test, the entry test, to get into the newspaper he's ultimately going to work for. So you kind of, well, admittedly, we don't really know that he's going to work for this newspaper, but we know what his job is, so it stood to reason that he probably would get in. But there's a lot of adversity facing him. He's trying to work for a newspaper that has never hired anyone who's not Japanese. When he's going to take the test, the woman who's sort of handing out the tests and like taking names and things like that tells him, oh, by the way, this test is in Japanese, like it's not in English. And he responds in Japanese saying that he knows. So he's very much the odd person out the entire time. He's constantly confronted with the idea that everyone doesn't really think he belongs there. When he does get the job at the newspaper, his direct supervisor actually tries to kick him out, thinking that he's just wandered in and he's not supposed to be there. So that's like a running thing throughout the whole episode, is that he's this outsider. But it also kind of feeds into, down the line, it feels like he's going to challenge some norms and challenge some of the status quo because he does think a little bit differently than everyone else. Yeah, I mean, this first episode is by and large his building up to the test, and then that's like the first third of the episode, and then from there it's kind of his first like week or something on the job, and him discovering some of the faux pas that he's not supposed to do. He's starting to become a little fascinated with the organized crime and the Yakuza. That seems to be his focus. There's not a lot of Ken Watanabe in this first episode. He only sees him briefly at a crime scene, and he kind of like watches from afar. He's like, oh, this detective looks cool and mysterious. And clearly later in the story, they're going to be working together, as the opening scene shows us. There's not a lot of him in this first episode, so we're going to get to him at some point in the show, but not in this first one. But before we go into other details, I'll say that it definitely has directorial style. Like I said, it feels kind of slick in places. It's got a lot of handheld. It's going for kind of that boots on the ground, almost feeling like you're a fly in the wall in a really tense situation when it is tense. And there's not a lot of tension in this first episode, which is maybe kind of, it leans away from what Michael Mann's good at for a large portion, because once it cuts back to 1999 and he's this like hardworking, well, he's not a student anymore, but he kind of gives off that he's only just stopped being a student recently. We see him teaching English and in his spare time, presumably for a little bit of money. We see him sort of dancing at a club. We see him just going about doing various things, building up to this test. And a lot of the stuff after that, it's him interacting with the new co-workers, it's him clashing with his bosses, all that stuff. I would say that a lot of that doesn't necessarily play to Michael Mann's strength, and it's all done well enough. There's some clear things set up in the writing to understand some character motivations, to understand who some people are and where things might go with them. So it's not a bad pilot in that sense. But I will say I definitely felt the length. The episode is a full hour long, and I got to a point where I was thinking, oh, this probably is ending soon, and I checked where I was in the timeline, and I was only about 35 minutes into the episode. There was still almost half the episode left, so it did kind of feel a little bit of a slog. And maybe that's why they have that opening scene set 10 years later to show you, hey, this is the thriller, this is the tense, thrilling drama that you're going to be seeing later in the show when it gets into the good stuff, when it gets into him actually having to deal with the Yakuza in a more direct fashion. So maybe that's why, you know, there's a couple of teases in this first episode of the mystery of him starting to dig into a case that, of course, the superiors don't want him to go for, but he notices a couple of things at some crime scenes that kind of link them. Presumably the Yakuza are related to both scenes. We don't know that for sure, though, in the first episode. So it kind of maybe suffers a little bit from that. It wants to tell its story in order from this really early point. And I'm not saying that they should have been cutting back and forth and maybe done like a split timeline thing where it's narratively jumping to an early part of his career that's relevant to what he's doing in the more interesting present day stuff. I'm not actually saying that's the right call, but I did kind of feel the sluggishness of the episode kind of coming in around the halfway mark, and it never really let up until the end. And that's not to say there wasn't interesting little bits or scenes as that went on. There's actually a very well directed sequence near the end with probably, I mean, there's definitely some music in the rest of the episode, but none of it really stood out. But there's a scene towards the end where you see kind of a Yakuza ritual taking place that's intercut with something else going on that I won't spoil, and it's very kind of serene. The music is kind of emotional, and it kind of, you get this sense of history, you get this sense of elegance to it, and it really just stuck out in the episode, which was otherwise we're trying to be, you know, very Michael Mann. It's very like almost guerrilla filmmaking looking, even though it's not, but that's how it feels because it's how he directs, and it's a lot of the handheld, it's a lot of the close-ups, a lot of the looking at for reactions in people's faces, like you're capturing them naturally, all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of scenes that are filmed like that, you know, when he gets his interview after his test, that scene's filmed like that, and it's sort of, you know, it almost feels like it's been filmed for a much tenser scenario than what it actually is. But yeah, so like I'm saying, there's like really well directed sequences sort of sprinkled throughout the whole episode. But it is a bit of a slow burn and getting going here, I feel, in this first one, because it cuts back to this part of his career where I'm not necessarily convinced all of it's going to be that necessary in the grand scheme of the story. That, and I could be completely wrong about that, but it didn't feel that necessary in actually watching the first episode. So I guess to sum up my main feelings is that it's got some good qualities, but I wouldn't say it necessarily grabbed me and made me want to watch like all 8 episodes with the first one. The first 3 came out together, for the record, so you can actually watch 1, 2, and 3 right now. As far as some specifics go, there's a couple of other actors in here that I recognize from other places. The actress from Pacific Rim is in here. She's like his direct supervisor. And they do set up some interesting things with her character in that she immediately chews him out for addressing her the wrong way by using her sort of her first name rather than her surname. She gets really stern with him, really says, you know, you think because you're an outsider the rules don't apply to you. Well, that's not the case, and gets really in his face. But then as the episode goes on, you see how she's treated by the higher ups, by her superiors, by even her peers. And you get the sense that there's probably a lot of sexism in the workplace here. She's expected to do things like when they're at the work party, at the bar during the episode, she's expected to effectively just get drinks for people the whole time, even though she's clearly relatively high ranking in the system, or at least above all the new people anyway. Whereas they're not expected to really do that. I mean, she does get Ansel Elgort to like help give out drinks at one point, but he only does it once, and then he sits down with his new friends, and that's it. And he comments on that it doesn't seem very fair that she has to do this all night. So you get kind of the sense that it's less of this mean streak that she has, and more that she's also kind of an outsider in a way, and she shouldn't be, but she's treated kind of like one. She's treated in a different way to most of the other employees. And the idea that maybe eventually she will actually sympathize with Ansel Elgort's character because of that. She will see something in him and they will maybe form not a romantic relationship, but a working relationship of respect. I can see that kind of forming, even though you don't see any like starts of that this episode. It kind of felt like it might be setting things like that up. And I think that's good. You know, there's some clear character potential that's set up immediately with that character. The other actor that I recognized from the TV show Legion and also Fargo, Rachel Keller's in this. She's only really in the one or two scenes. She's like a high class escort place, and she's like singing "Sweet Child of Mine," but most of it's in Japanese. I don't know if the actress knew Japanese first, or if she learned some Japanese, or just learned parts of this song phonetically just so she could do it. Which is a good point as well, is that Miles Teller, not Miles Teller. Joe, I made this mistake last week. I mistakenly said Miles Teller was in this instead of Ansel Elgort, and it's occurred to me that ever since I've made that mistake that they could like be brothers in something. But yeah, Ansel Elgort, like he speaks a lot of Japanese in this show, and I don't know how much of that he learned for the show, if it's just phonetic, whatever. But it is a show that does have a lot of subtitled sections. There's a lot of Japanese actors, obviously, in this. Naturally, it's set in Tokyo, so there's a lot of subtitle sequences. It's also a very visual show. I think one of the interesting things that the premise of having this English-speaking main character set in Japan, and it's made primarily, obviously, for an English-speaking audience. I mean, maybe it'll do well in Japan as well, but what's interesting about it is that it forces a lot of the early stuff to be very visual-based, because while there are subtitled scenes, there's a lot of it where you just get things through his reactions to other people, how he interacts with the world. It forces a lot of it to the point where I would say there's a good 15-20 minutes near the start of the episode where there's actually not a whole lot of dialogue, other than just, you know, general background phrases that are being yelled at each other, like hello, goodbye, that kind of thing. A lot of it is him studying, it's him going to his class, it's him doing these other things, and a lot of it is very much in the visuals, and you do have to pay attention to the visuals to follow the story. And I do appreciate when a show or a movie does kind of really put a lot into its visuals, and it feels like the visuals are important, and it's not just, oh, you could basically just listen to this and not miss anything, like some more generic TV could be. So I guess that's a sign that it comes from a movie director, it comes from a talented movie director who is putting a lot in here, and obviously the script as well, but I think you do feel that quality there. But yeah, Rachel Keller's character, she is set up, I presume, as some kind of a love interest, or at the very least some character who is, you know, maybe going to be a bit of a femme fatale coming in and out of Ansel Elgort's radius as the show goes on. But like I say, the plot of this first episode is that there's a murder, you know, on the street, but he learns that no one in Japan will tend to use that word. The cop that he talks to later on specifically says there's no murder in Japan. There may be manslaughter, there may be accidental suicides, but there's no murder. And it's sort of him learning about the corruption, or at the very least learning how the world interacts with the Yakuza. And even the opening scene that is like sets up the tense scene where he's putting on the stab vest and he's going for a meeting with the Yakuza. The Yakuza is basically saying, you're the story you're investigating right now, you should stop that. Like, you know, right from the start of the show, it sets up that this is going to be about an investigative person interacting with the Yakuza and all of the politics and nuance that comes with that. And so much of it is, again, him being the outsider and him maybe challenging the status quo and the way things are. It's interesting because you have a lot of stories in Hollywood and in TV where you have the white American who is the main character in a different setting. Depending on what you do with that, it can feel very cliche, it can feel very tropey. At its worst, you end up with a white savior problem. I don't think this ever feels like it's going into that territory, at least in this episode. It feels very much like it's kind of trying to view an outsider trying to prove himself in a system that is not made for him. And it does feel like he's going to make lots of mistakes and get into a lot of trouble along the way. Now, you could have a bit of a problem perhaps by the end where maybe he is just getting too good. And to an extent, he already is kind of a wunderkind because he is able to take this test that's in Japanese because he still scores higher than everyone else, even though he kind of makes this really dumb mistake in the test. He inherently, because he's having to try harder and be tougher and break down these barriers, he's inherently shown as being a stronger, smarter character than a lot of the other people his age. That said, though, when it comes to talking to anyone who's older than him in this show, he tends to be put in his place quite often. So, but it is something to kind of look into. I think the performances are interesting because obviously Ansel Elgort is not someone that I would say is inherently likable. But then again, I'm not entirely sure if this character is supposed to be just like a super likable dude. He is kind of obsessed. He's kind of like determined in what he's doing. He's determined to be this reporter. He probably fits the role. I'm not sure if the role is appealing or if the characters is appealing to the audience as perhaps you would like, but he probably fits what they're going for with this character. I will say his character, I think they do a good job, again, visually early on of kind of showing how determined he is, of showing how much he cares, and showing the life that he's trying to build for himself. Probably the worst part of like how they introduce his motivation is there's a throwaway line in the interview with the newspaper where he's asked why he wants to do this type of work. He's asked why he wants to do criminal investigations, and he just kind of he has like a throwaway line about his father being a coroner and how he would see some of the reports and some of the evidence and stuff, and he'd like to think about the mystery of it and the how and the why and all the rest of it. And that's something else that's brought up is when he's being told the format for the articles they're going to write, because he's a newbie, so all the newbies all do the sort of the general police report stuff, not the exciting investigative stuff, because they're all new people. They get the grunt work, but they're told, oh, you have to put in the what, the when, the where, the who, and he says, what about the why? And she says, oh, if there's space at the end, you can put in the why. The why is not the priority in this newspaper, at least for these types of stories. And you get the feeling that the why is very important to him. And I assume there's more to the backstory. I assume there's more about his relationship with his father. I assume there's more to his motivation. It felt a little bit clunky though, because everything else in this episode, as far as like showing you who this character is, was done fairly well in a very visual manner. That clunky line of just throwing out that, well, my dad was this, it just felt a little bit more TV writing, I guess, a little bit more generic network TV than everything else and how it was presented to you. I think, like I say, I think where it falls down is how much of a slog it started to feel in the second half of the episode. There's a point where he's trying to befriend a police officer to get some information about how to interact with the police in Japan, about him clashing with his superiors, where he's talking with his co-workers about clashing with his superiors, and it does kind of feel like we go a little bit in a circle there, a touch. And I get that we have to set up the adversity that he's facing, we have to set up the obstacles that are getting in his way, but it does kind of feel like it could have used maybe something more of a hook to really hang the episode around. Like I said, there's some really well directed stuff towards the end of the episode. There's a sort of big event that he witnesses that's fairly standalone, but obviously has implications and opens his mind as far as like thinking about the mystery goes. But it does, like, there is a big portion of this episode where it feels like there's a lot of like just talking heads at each other, and I don't necessarily think the dialogue is engaging enough. I don't think his scene with Rachel Keller's character Samantha, where there's a bit of a flirtation and talking about why they're both in Japan, I don't think that's like, it's fine, and I like her well enough that like I was into the scene to begin with, but it kind of went on a bit long, and I don't know if I necessarily got a spark of chemistry or anything like that. I don't know if the dialogue is. This is the sort of thing where I'm not saying I want it to be a Tarantino thing, right? Because it's not the tone that it's going for. But it's the first thing I think of when I think of like the dialogue making long long just back and forth scenes between two characters at a table. Tarantino's very good at that. He's a very witty dialogue writer. But there's definitely other examples. In fact, there's other examples even in Michael Mann. You think of De Niro and Pacino in Heat, or you think of just so many scenes in Collateral, which is my favorite Michael Mann movie with Tom Cruise and Jamie Foxx. There's a lot of just good back and forth there where you're kind of on the hook for all the conversation. And I don't think any of the conversations that are meaty in this first episode have any of that hook. They don't have any of that, oh, I am kind of waiting with bated breath on every line, because the conversation is revealing something about the plot or about the danger that he's in or about where we're going with this. Like every line in the dialogue in Collateral is setting up or hinting at the motivations of either character. It's setting up what might be going on, and once the threat is really revealed, it's this like play of how they're handling this relationship between this like sort of kidnapped taxi driver and the hitman who's sort of taking him around the city to kill people with. That's like super fascinating stuff, and I think part of that is because it's a movie, it's 2 hours long, it has to get to this point, so the dialogue is kind of intentionally very strategic at all times. Whereas I think because this is an 8-episode TV show, it's kind of taking its time and languishing and just, oh, we get to be in this nightclub in Tokyo as he's talking to this cop and asking him about Japan. And I don't know if it's just inherently as exciting or as engaging. Again, I think maybe just wittier dialogue or just some sort of hook in this episode, some sort of scene for it to build to, or crisis to put him in that would be a dramatic scene. So I guess what I'm saying is the direction is very good, but I feel like the writing could maybe be just a bit better. The writing just feels a bit more generic. I won't say it's generic network TV. It feels more like generic cable TV to me, the writing. But the direction's pretty good. So there you go. I don't even really feel like I need to go into a spoiler section. Obviously, I talked about a lot of what's in the episode anyway. A lot of it is the setup stuff. I talked around anything that I probably felt would be a spoiler. But I think inherently that's actually something that maybe is a gauge that you can use for first episodes for pilots, is if I come out of it and say there's basically nothing that to spoil that I want to talk about, that is maybe a bit of a negative in a weird way, because there's no like real big thing they add on to it, because so often first episodes are just setting up the premise, so there's usually not as much to spoil in a first episode, especially if you've seen a trailer or you just know what the log line is. So much of it feels fair to just tell you because this is the setup of the show, this is what it's going to be. But usually there's at least one big thing that it sort of introduces as an idea, and I don't know if this does that. I don't think it does. So there you go. That is my thoughts on Tokyo Vice episode 1. By all means, let me know what you thought of the first episode in the comments below. If you watch more of it, by all means come back and let me know too if it's worth seeing. If you watched all 3 episodes that are out, let me know. But like, subscribe, ding the bell for notifications, all that stuff helps us out a lot. And of course, if you want to support the channel and the content and everything we do, head over to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and you can support us for as little as $1 per month and get some bonuses for your trouble. But otherwise, that is me. So thank you very much once again for watching or listening. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?